Thank you, Chairman. And Dr. Toll, you served as a convening lead author in Working Group 2, is that right?
Correct.
Who nominated you to that?
The Irish government.
And you noted that it is often the case that environmental agencies do the nominating, but in your case, it was not an environmental agency, is that right?
It was the Environmental Protection Agency of Ireland.
But it was ultimately the government's appointment?
Yes.
Okay. And it's correct that there were 308 total convening authors in Working Group 2, is that right?
308 authors, yes.
You were one of the 308?
Correct.
How many scientists in the world at the time that you were appointed to that working group were working in this area of science? Can you estimate?
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands. So you were in a working group, one of 308 in an area with tens of thousands of scientists?
Yes.
And it's your position that competent people have been excluded because their views do not reflect the views of government from the working group?
That's correct.
Yet you have views that are different from the working group, right?
Correct.
And Dr. Oppenheimer pointed out that many times you're a loud voice against the views of the majority. Is that right?
That's also correct.
Yet you were still included in the working group.
I would argue that I'm an exception, yes.
Okay. And you describe in your testimony mishaps in the process, yes?
Yes.
And you stated that you're worried about groupthink. Is that right?
Correct.
And you also said that there should be protections against groupthink. Is that right?
Correct.
So you had a lot of concerns about IPCC. Safe to say?
Yes.
And you were one of the few scientists in the whole world, one of 308 who had the privilege and honor of being at the table as these decisions were being made. That's safe to say, right?
Yes.
But instead of fighting within the IPCC to be a force for reform and fight against groupthink and be a force for the minority of views, you chose to quit the working group. Is that right?
No, I am still a convening lead author of Chapter 10 of Working Group 2. I quit the drafting team of the Summary for Policymakers.
Okay. So you used, in your words, step down from the Summary of Policymakers team for Working Group 2?
Yes.
Okay. Were there any other scientists in Working Group 2 that quit?
I don't think so.
You were the only one?
Yes.
You would agree, Dr. Toll, with the following statement: climate change is occurring and most likely caused by humans?
Correct.
And in fact, you wrote in June 2013, it is well known that most papers and most authors in the climate literature support the hypothesis that anthropogenic climate change, that most papers and most authors in the climate literature support the hypothesis of anthropogenic climate change. It does not matter. It does not matter whether the exact number is 90% or 99.9%. Is that right?
I can't recall that exact quote, but I would agree with that statement. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Toll. And Dr. Pilkey, you stated that it would make no difference if we reduced our carbon emissions by 50%. Is that correct? You told
No, I didn't say it would make no difference. It just makes it makes more difference if you reduce it 50% than if you reduce it 25%. No.
Do you think we should double our carbon emissions? Would that make any difference?
You would have an effect. You'd have more radiative forcing if you increase CO2. I mean, you use the model. The models are the tools that you use to assess that, and they would tell you put more CO2 in there, you get more positive radiative forcing. You take it out, you get less radiative forcing. I think the problem is that we're confusing when we talk about anthropogenic climate forcing. People think fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is one of them. There's a whole range of them. There was an Academy report back in 2005 that talked about broadening out this perspective. We have to look at these other things. There's black carbon, there's land use change, there's other aerosol effects. It's a more complicated problem, and I think one of the problems with the National Climate Assessment is they focus on fossil fuels. So that's what you're asking the question about, but really our impact on the environment is much broader than that.
Would we be healthier and better off if we doubled our carbon emissions or reduce them by 50%?
If we're healthier or not, I don't know about that question. But in terms of how our climate impact is, you double the CO2, you have more of a climate impact than you have half. But health is not the right question because CO2 is not a pollutant like a traditional
Would you
pollutant.
prefer to live in a world that doubled its carbon emissions or one that cut them in half?
Everything else being equal, that's an interesting question, actually.
That's why we brought you here.
Well, that's an interesting question. But no, now I was coming here to talk about the science and some of the science issues. That's a question that's a broad range question about what is the benefits and costs of doubling or decreasing CO2. Obviously, if we have less emissions into the atmosphere, it's a positive thing. That includes aerosols, that includes nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, et cetera. All of that is beneficial. We don't put anything in the atmosphere. We don't put anything in the ocean. But the reality of it is we have to try to optimize that. And I think we need a broad-based approach to this problem and not focusing on just one issue, which is what the question you're asking is.
Thank you, Dr. Pilkey. Thank you, Dr. Toll.
Thank you, Mr.
And
Toll.
I yield back the balance of my time.